APUSH students, let's cover everything you need for Period 7. Before we start, print out the free speed review sheet that goes along with this video. The link is in the description below. Go ahead and look at Period 7. Circle any people, events, or vocab, things that you don't quite remember that you know you need to focus on when you study. Once you've mastered those topics, you can check them off and move on to the next one. All right, here we go. Frederick Jackson Turner published his frontier thesis after the 1890 census, where he declared that the American frontier was closed. He also argued that the American identity was based on conquering these Western lands. Now that there was no more frontier in the continental U.S., Americans began to look outwards for raw materials and new markets. One of the first acts of American imperialism was the Hawaiian coup. Americans living in Hawaii were capitalizing off of the sugar trade, so they helped to overthrow the Hawaiian monarch so the U.S. could annex Hawaii. In addition to the lucrative sugar trade, Hawaii was also a strategic location in the Pacific, giving America a stepping stone to Asian markets. Two important imperialists that you want to know are Alfred Mahan and Josiah Strong. Mahan, an American naval officer, argued that a strong navy was critical for America's growth and power, while Strong was a minister who believed it was the duty of Americans to spread their culture and religion throughout the world. Imperialist ideals also led to the U.S. involvement in the Spanish-American War, which demonstrated a significant change in American foreign policy. Some Americans felt compelled to support Cuba in their independence from Spain. These feelings were heightened by yellow journalists like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Tensions escalated when reporters published a DeLone letter where a Spanish diplomat criticized and insulted President McKinley. A week later, the USS Maine sunk in Havana's harbor. The press published this as the work of Spanish minds, leading Congress to declare war. The war ended with an American victory. The Treaty of Paris granted America Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico. America also purchased the Philippines. And although the conflict with Spain lasted just a few months, the Philippine-American War carried on for years. There are several significant foreign policies you definitely want to know for Period 7. First is John Hay's open door policy, which gave America access to foreign markets in China while also keeping it out of European control. Next was the Roosevelt Corollary, which was an expansion of the Monroe Doctrine. Theodore Roosevelt argued that the U.S. had a right to intervene in Latin American affairs to protect their economic interests and maintain stability in the region. President Taft supported dollar diplomacy, which sought to secure order in Latin America through economic means like investment and loans. And Woodrow Wilson implemented moral diplomacy, which meant the U.S. would try to support governments who emphasized democracy and free trade. At the turn of the century, America experienced a period of social, economic, and political reform known as the Progressive Era. Journalists called muckrakers used expose journalism to fight corruption. For example, Lincoln Steffens wrote The Shame of the Cities to expose political corruption. And Ida Tarbell wrote about John D. Rockefeller's ruthless tactics while he was growing his Standard Oil Company. The most famous was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry and led to the establishment of the Food and Drug Act as well as the Meat Inspection Act. Teddy Roosevelt's presidency was focused on reform. He sought to break up bad trusts and monopolies, and his Square Deal focused on consumer protections, controlling corporations, and conservation. Economic reforms included the Clayton Antitrust Act. This strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act and limited the power of monopolies. And President Wilson signed the 16th Amendment, which instituted the federal income tax, and he created the Federal Reserve. Political reform focused on voting practices. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. Americans also saw the introduction of initiative, referendum, recall, and the secret ballot. Just like they had in other periods, women played a major role in bringing about reforms. Carrie Nation fought for temperance, which led to the 18th Amendment. Alice Paul and groups like the National American Women's Suffrage Association contributed to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which finally allowed women the right to vote after World War I. In 1914, the Great War broke out in Europe, but President Wilson was determined to stay isolated and declared neutrality. However, the American economy benefited significantly selling supplies, especially to the Allied powers. Despite Wilson winning re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," America ultimately joined the war in 1917 after Germany continued using unrestricted submarine warfare on American merchant vessels. Americans also felt threatened after the Zimmerman telegram was released in the press. While young men were drafted or volunteered with the American Expeditionary Forces, women and minorities stepped up at home to keep the country running by filling jobs in factories or on the farms. And just like in previous wars, American liberties were restricted. During World War I, Congress passed the Espionage and the Sedition Act. Towards the end of the conflict, Wilson crafted his 14 points in hopes of preventing another global crisis. However, most of the points were ignored in the Treaty of Versailles because Britain and France wanted to punish Germany by forcing them to sign the War Guilt Clause and pay heavy reparations. The only one of Wilson's 14 points that was incorporated was the League of Nations, an international peacekeeping body. This made the treaty ratification process difficult for the Senate. Reservationists like Henry Cabot Lodge disagreed with Article X of the treaty, which required countries to join the League of Nations. They feared that this would drag America into another global conflict. Instead, they favored a return to isolationism. At the turn of the century, we also saw a renewed push for African American civil rights. In 1909, prominent leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Thurgood Marshall formed the NAACP to fight for equality, justice, and rights. They also sought to tackle disenfranchisement in the South. Marcus Garvey, on the other hand, supported Black nationalism, economic self-sufficiency, and a Back to Africa movement. Around the same time, millions of African Americans left the oppressive Jim Crow South in search of jobs and freedoms in the North. This became known as the Great Migration. And after World War I, the growing number of African Americans in northern cities like Harlem led to the Harlem Renaissance. Artists like Langston Hughes shared the oppression of the African Americans through poetry, while musicians like Louis Armstrong ushered in the Jazz Age. Later, leaders like A. Philip Randolph helped fight for equality in employment practices. He threatened to march on Washington, D.C. to protest discrimination in defense industry jobs as America mobilized for World War II. This forced SDR to create the Fair Employment Practices Committee and inspired future civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. And during World War II, African Americans made significant contributions both serving in the war and working in industries at home. This led to the Double V campaign, which fought for victory abroad over fascism and victory at home for equality. After World War I, America entered a period known as the Roaring Twenties. It was characterized by rapid economic growth and a culture of consumerism. Americans were eager to buy goods that were scarce during World War I, as well as new appliances and the radio. But America also entered into a Red Scare. Following the Russian Revolution, Americans were afraid of communists coming into the country, which increased nativism. This led to the Quota Acts, which severely limited immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. Prohibition dominated the 1920s, but ultimately it was a failed social experiment that led to the rise of organized crime. The most famous crime ring was Chicago's Al Capone. American women celebrated their contributions to World War I and the passage of the 19th Amendment. Some adopted the flapper style by cutting their hair, wearing short skirts, and smoking and drinking in public. However, many also held on to the traditional Victorian values. And finally, in 1925, John T. Scopes was arrested for teaching evolution in a Tennessee public school. The Scopes monkey trial was a media spectacle, and it represented the ongoing debate between modern values and fundamentalist ideas. This was a theme that had dominated the decade. Much of the economic growth of the 1920s was through expansion of consumer credit and unregulated banking practices. While consumers used credit cards to buy cars or washing machines, investors bought stock on margin. Both factories and farms contributed to overproduction, causing prices to drop. All of this played a role in the stock market crash known as Black Tuesday, the official start of the Great Depression. And this coincided with the Dust Bowl, which forced farmers to migrate in search of work. President Hoover continued the laissez-faire policies of previous presidents because he thought the economic crisis would fix itself. However, after unemployment reached 25% and homelessness continued to rise, he realized he needed to take action. Despite creating the Reconstruction Finance Corps to provide loans and create jobs, it was too late. Franklin D. Roosevelt beat Hoover in a landslide election in 1932. FDR ran on his New Deal platform where he promised to provide relief, reform, and recovery for the American people. Upon taking office, he instituted the fireside chats where he used the radio to connect with the American public and help rebuild confidence in the government. After announcing his bank holiday, FDR's first New Deal passed, creating the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the Federal Emergency Relief Act, all within the first 100 days. His second New Deal followed, which included further reforms like the Social Security Act. Despite creating millions of jobs and instituting significant economic reform, many criticized FDR and his New Deal. While Huey Long argued that the New Deal did not do enough to help the poor and working class, business leaders argued that the New Deal bordered on socialism. He was also criticized for trying to pack the Supreme Court in an effort to protect his legislation after several of his New Deal programs were declared unconstitutional. But ultimately, the Great Depression didn't end until World War II. As tensions mounted in Europe with the rise of fascism, America passed a series of neutrality acts, but gradually got more involved with the Allied cause. In 1939, FDR approved the Cash and Carry program, which was followed by the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. The Selective Service Act was also passed, which was America's first peacetime draft. Ultimately, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, forced America to join the war. This caused an increase in anti-Japanese sentiments. Executive Order 9066 forced Japanese Americans living on the West Coast into internment camps for the duration of the war. This was later upheld by the Supreme Court in the Korematsu case. Once America entered the war, many American minority groups supported the effort. Over 1 million African Americans served in World War II, but all branches of the armed forces remained segregated. The Tuskegee Airmen served as the first African American pilots in the armed forces. About 45,000 Native Americans also also enlisted in the war, both men and women. The Navajo code talkers in the Pacific and the Comanche in Europe played a vital role in the American war effort. And for the first time, women were allowed to enlist in the military in groups like the Women's Army Corps. They served in a variety of non-combat positions like nurses, telephone operators, truck drivers, and mechanics. But on the home front, once again, women filled the positions of the men who had left from the war, as seen with Rosie the Riveter. During the war, American troops helped the Allied forces defeat Hitler in Europe, with leaders like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who helped lead the D-Day campaign. At the same time, the island hopping campaign was used in the Pacific to fight the Japanese. At home, the Office of Scientific Research and Development also worked on the top-secret Manhattan Project developing a new technology, the atomic bomb. Even though Germany surrendered in May of 1945, Japanese forces continued to fight. President Truman, who took over after FDR's death, would accept nothing but unconditional surrender from Japan. He approved the use of the atomic bomb. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan finally surrendered in the fall of 1945, officially ending World War II. So what does this look like on exam day? For causation, you will probably be asked about the causes of imperialism, the causes of the Great Depression, or the effects of the New Deal. For comparison, you could be asked about similarities and differences on the home front between the First and Second World Wars. Or you could be asked about the difference in the fundamental values versus modernism in the 1920s. And for continuity and change, they'll likely ask about changes in foreign policy, so be ready to talk about the interwar period. You could also be asked about changes during the Progressive Era, so be ready to write about the progressive amendments and economic reforms like the Federal Reserve. Check out the APUSH Ultimate Review Packet for more help. We've got timeline, study guides, and essay practice. Follow the link in the description below for a free preview. And if you think this video was helpful, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.